Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Cozzy. Unfortunately, during the Get to Know You session, one of my bosses pointed a little bit too quickly at me when asked about who was the most overpaid on the table. But when it came to who was the most attractive, I was pointed at again. So swings and roundabouts. And understanding strategic risks are really about the swings and roundabouts of life that this industry will face. We need to understand what the risk is so that we can prepare for the downside. But also by understanding those strategic risks, we can be prepared and ready to respond in a faster manner than we could otherwise to the upside, to the potential that risks bring. When Captain Cook made landfall not far from here at Botany Bay, the Australian red meat industry began. With a humble collection of cows, goats and sheep, the industry has now grown to a multi-billion-dollar contributor to the Australian economy that directly and indirectly employs hundreds of thousands of people. This vital role in Australia's economic health and competitiveness, and also in our social and cultural fabric, should not be underplayed when considering why the wider industry needs to understand and be responsive to the strategic risks it faces. Because it is these strategic risks that pose a threat to the ongoing sustainability and prosperity of red meat production and processing in this country. By understanding these strategic risks, the industry will be better positioned to identify where it must invest its limited resources to ensure ongoing viability and sustainability. This conference is a testament to the forward thinking of the Australian Meat Processor Corporation in working to understand the strategic risk environment, not only for processors, but also for the wider industry. We know from past experience that long-term industry sustainability and prosperity is never guaranteed. In an increasingly complex and fast-moving world where prosperous industries are quickly overtaken by external changes that were not foreseen or planned for, or more agile and aggressive competitors who capitalise on their competitive advantages to take market share and become the dominant industry player, the threat posed by strategic risks is very real and must be managed in a considered and informed manner. So what are strategic risks? When working with the AMPC to identify the strategic risks facing your industry, we began by defining them as something that at a corporate and industry level has the potential to materially impact the health, longevity and prosperity of the red meat industry. This definition quickly distinguishes strategic risks from those risks of doing business, such as operational, financial or compliance risk, that should be planned for and addressed as part of diligent risk management processes. While important to individual businesses, these kinds of risks do not meet the threshold characteristic of impacting in a material manner at an industry-wide level. Too often, however, companies and industries focus on these risks of doing business alone, to the detriment of effectively planning for an uncertain future. Prior to the identification of the industry's strategic risks, we worked with the AMPC to identify and understand the major global and industry trends that are occurring now and will continue to do so over the coming decade. This process highlighted what we describe as global megatrends: the digital transformation impacting industries across the globe, shifts in the global marketplace from west to east and south, changes in the way we work that continue to transform industries, an increasingly urbanised world that brings consumers closer together, increasing global demand for resources that must be sustainable in a resource-constrained environment, and health reimagined, where increasingly costly healthcare is driving change in consumer and government behaviour. These global trends were used to identify 8 key industry trends: global growth being driven out of Asia, an increasing reliance of Australia's red meat industry on exports, increasing export market competitiveness, changing consumer consumption patterns, an increased focus on and need for food safety and quality, ongoing climate change, a challenging domestic resource environment, and increasingly higher environmental, animal welfare and food safety standards around the world. Together, This assessment of global and industry-specific trends supported the analysis and identification of the critical strategic risks that have the potential to impact the sustainability of Australia's red meat industry over the coming 5 to 10 year period. The 6 primary strategic risks are competition, changing consumption patterns, climate change, social licence to operate, the regulatory environment, and value chain integration. At a competitive level, the Australian industry has grown to be a critical global exporter of red meat products, led by processed exports. Historically, Australia has also indirectly benefited from disease outbreaks in America, the United Kingdom, Brazil, and India that have limited their ability to export internationally, and thankfully not been experienced in Australia. However, recent years have seen the removal of trade barriers faced by these competitors, and when combined with extremely low cattle and processing costs and a range of other economic factors in the likes of Brazil and India, products from these countries are winning market share in Australia's key export destinations. Of course, this threat is currently compounded by the high price of cattle in Australia and our processing cost disadvantage. Domestically, the industry competes with itself between live and processed exports, and red meat has continued to lose market share to other forms of protein for local consumption, primarily pork and chicken. While these factors are impacting the industry today, based on overall industry and economic trends, we expect this threat of competition to increase in intensity in the coming years, posing a substantial strategic risk that will require a well-considered plan that allows the industry to respond effectively and quickly. The consumer landscape for protein products has changed dramatically in recent decades. Western nations have experienced substantial declines in red meat consumption, replaced by lower cost substitutes and products that consumers may perceive to be healthier or fit better into their diet and lifestyle choices. In the key export markets of Asia, the consumption of red meat differs to Western nations, where local cuisines typically call for different cuts and forms of preparation that place less emphasis on the quality attributes Australian production tends to favour, while consumer economics and income levels differ substantially to those in the West. If the industry doesn't maintain a comprehensive understanding of these consumption trends, the very real risk exists that they will continue to change and the Australian industry will be unable to provide products that meet customer needs at a price the customer is willing to pay. The impact of climate change has already had implications for Australian agriculture and will continue to have a wide set of impacts on the industry in coming years. From increasingly frequent extreme weather events through to changing rainfall patterns and methane emissions from Australia's cattle herd, the strategic risk of climate change touches all parts of the industry. The implications of these changes are very real for the industry today and will likely pose an ongoing greater impact as time progresses. By recognising this now, the industry will be well prepared to effectively target its efforts and initiatives to ensure a sustainable future despite the environmental challenges that arise. The requirement of a social licence to operate for both individual firms and entire industries has become increasingly important in recent years. For the red meat industry, many of the issues that will impact on its social licence to operate will continue to be based around the intensity of resource use required for meat production and the code of conduct of the industry. For example, how an increasingly hot climate may result in cattle distress in traditional pasture regions, animal welfare issues, the threat of disease and humane slaughtering practices are all issues that will have an impact on social licence. As a strategic risk, the social licence to operate for all industries is complex to communicate and effectively manage. For the red meat industry, which has established its social licence and capital over many years of operation and engagement in Australian life, the risk of losing its licence would have profound and far-reaching consequences. These typically can include burdensome or unbearable regulatory costs through to political decisions that limit domestic or international market access. In recent years, this damage to social licence has been felt by industries as wide-ranging as live cattle exports through to mining, financial planning and greyhound racing, with the impacts ranging from increased financial costs through to wholesale transformation of the industry. As a strategic risk, the regulatory environment is one that is critical to long-term sustainability and prosperity. National and international regulation of the red meat industry has resulted in a wide range of industry bodies and advocacy groups managing and engaging with a regulatory environment at a state, federal and international level, often with substantial duplication and overlap. Broadly, the industry response has been successful to date. However, we expect the regulatory environment to become increasingly important going forward. Internationally, the increasing reliance on exports and the exposure to foreign regulators poses an ongoing risk of market access. Australian dairy exports to China exemplify this, with the temporary halting of Murray Goulburn's long-life milk sales due to concerns it had not entered the country via the correct channels, the Camperdown Dairy fresh milk export dispute, and more recently, the suspension of Viplus Dairy's import licence. These individual cases highlight just some of the international regulatory factors that can impact the wider industry. At a domestic level, the industry has faced increasing regulatory requirements across the value chain, from the environmental impact of primary producers through to effluent discharge by processors. Looking forward into the future, the confluence of an uncertain international regulatory environment and export market access, with increased regulatory burdens and costs domestically, poses a strategic risk that will directly impact the sustainability and prosperity of the wider red meat industry via higher costs and burdensome red tape. Of course, this will only worsen the red meat cost position in both international and domestic markets. The final strategic risk of value chain integration addresses the current fragmentation of the Australian red meat industry that can potentially drive up industry costs while reducing agility to respond to market changes. Anecdotally, the actions of different participants within the value chain have also resulted in a loss of trust between different industry participants, which limits the ability for collaboration or the sharing of data and information that could improve processes and efficiencies and consequently reduce costs for the wider industry. For the Australian industry that already produces cattle and processes them at a higher cost than our international competitors, and domestically sells for a higher cost than other protein substitutes, the added burden of an unintegrated value chain will potentially impact on the sustainability and prosperity of the industry going forward, as these competitors and substitutes reduce costs and improve processes and quality. Following on from the identification of these strategic risks, the AMPC has already started to take action to address and mitigate them. From collaborative research with the CSIRO on reducing cattle methane emissions via new sources of feed, through to the enhanced use of robotics and technology in processing to improve productivity, targeted actions are being taken now to prepare for the future. In my introductory remarks, I commented that long-term sustainability and prosperity are not guaranteed. The strategic risks outlined this morning and for discussion during this conference all have the potential to undermine industry sustainability on an individual basis, but may also precipitate the occurrence of another. For example, the impact of climate change can result in altered social attitudes to red meat production, which could damage the industry's social licence to operate. By preparing for these now, however, and tracking them as the industry changes over time, not only will the Australian industry be better prepared to mitigate them before they negatively impact the industry, but it will be positioned to capitalise on the opportunities that they create. Only by being positioned to effectively mitigate and respond to strategic risks before they impact the industry and to capitalise on opportunities as they arise, will industry successes that have been experienced in the past be replicated in the future. In leaving, the question before us now is how do we as an industry respond to these strategic risks, protect and grow our market share both domestically and globally, and ensure we are positioned to capitalise on opportunities as and when they arise. Thank you for your time.